Joe Bandel's Oak matrix claims that human awareness is actively fragmented into specific astral bodies directly corresponding to the periodic table's noble gases, a model where helium represents spiritual unity and the super-heavy synthetic element Oganesson acts as an etheric womb. It is a dense, layered framework from his 2025 book, The Oak Matrix, Dance of Opposites, that forces a reconciliation between cold chemistry and deep esoteric mysticism. Miles, looking at Anchor 4, this concept of noble gas bodies and integration, what strikes me first is the sheer audacity of mapping the Kabbalistic Sephiroth directly onto elements like xenon and radon.
The audacity is the fundamental point of the entire text. Bandel published this work as a modern mystery school framework, calling it a Frankenstein's patchwork of opposites. He explicitly rejects the idea that duality is a war. Instead, he treats it as a generative embrace. When we look at Anchor 4, he takes these stable, inert elements, the noble gases, and assigns them profound psychological and metaphysical states. Helium becomes spiritual unity. Neon is mental light. Argon represents emotional fire. He uses the periodic table as a psychological map to explain how human consciousness fragments and ultimately how it must reintegrate.
We should break down that map because it requires a significant conceptual leap for anyone grounded purely in traditional physics. In chemistry, noble gases are defined by their complete valence electron shells. They do not react easily. They represent stability. Bandel uses that chemical stability as a metaphor for spiritual or astral permanence. He calls them stable Sephiroth, or shadows of Oganesson. Let us start with Oganesson itself, element 118. It is highly radioactive and unstable in the physical world, yet Bandel frames it as the etheric womb. That feels entirely contradictory.
It appears contradictory if you only look at the physical half-life of Oganesson, which is measured in milliseconds. Esoterically, Bandel positions Oganesson as the ultimate container, the unified field from which all other states emerge. By calling it an etheric womb, he suggests that the heaviest, most complex element on the periodic table represents a state of total, unified awareness. The lighter noble gases, helium, neon, argon, krypton, xenon, radon, are seen as fragmented components of that whole. Each of those gases, in his framework, forges a specific astral body with its own unique awareness.
So a person is not just a single monolithic consciousness. Instead, the mental layer is governed by the archetype of neon, which Bandel calls mental light. The upper emotional state resonates with krypton, while the lower emotional state is linked to xenon. Radon, being heavier and naturally radioactive, anchors the elemental or sexual drive. It reads like a highly updated scientific spin on ancient chakra systems, or the Kabbalistic tree of life.
That is an accurate assessment. Bandel is known for taking concepts from hard science, like chaos theory and physics, and weaving them into metaphysics. We see this in his earlier concepts as well. For instance, in Anchor 2 of the Oak Matrix, he discusses how chaos is not destruction, but the necessary heartbeat of evolution. He applies Ilya Prigozhin's theory of dissipative structures, how a system builds energy chaotically until it reaches a bifurcation point and leaps to a higher state of stability, to human consciousness. In Anchor 4, that chaos leap is the mechanism for integration.
The integration process is described as activating rings and syncing via archetypal resonance. That terminology borrows heavily from both particle physics and music theory. It suggests that these disparate astral bodies, the neon mental state, the argon emotional fire, operate at different frequencies, When a person experiences fragmented awareness, that creates stress within the overall biological and spiritual system.
Bandel argues that we are conditioned to fear that stress or instability. In his framework, the stress caused by fragmented awareness is the fuel for the evolutionary leap. You activate the rings, which function as the energetic boundaries of these different gas bodies, and force them into archetypal resonance. Once the first 2 points share a frequency, you can pull the mental, emotional, and drive layers into unity. The chaos leap is the moment the system stops fighting itself and reorganizes into that unified self, which he describes as Oganesson's womb.
Let us examine helium, which he equates to spiritual unity. Helium is the second most abundant element in the observable universe, yet on Earth it is rare and constantly escaping our atmosphere into space because it is so light. Using helium as the symbol for spiritual unity implies that this state is fundamental to the cosmos, but difficult to hold on to in our dense physical reality.
That is a beautiful correlation. Helium wants to rise. It wants to escape the gravitational pull of the Earth. Similarly, the spiritual unity it represents in Bandel's model is not something you can easily pin down in daily life. It is the lightest, most pervasive state, yet the most elusive. Contrast that with neon, the mental light. Neon is known for its bright, piercing illumination when electrified. It represents the sharp, clarifying power of the intellect. But intellect alone is not enough. Neon needs the foundational weight of the other gases to be useful, otherwise it is just cold light.
I have a hard time accepting the practical application of this. It remains a compelling theoretical construct, but how one actually syncs via archetypal resonance in daily life is unclear. It sounds like an intellectual exercise rather than a lived experience. If I feel a deep tension between my intellectual understanding of a problem, my neon mental light, and my visceral elemental reaction, my radon drive, how does mapping them to inert gases resolve that tension?
The value lies in the detachment it offers. By objectifying internal states as different bodies governed by distinct elemental rules, you stop identifying with the conflict. If you view lower emotional turmoil not as a personal failure, but as the natural frequency of your xenon astral body, you create psychological distance. Bandel's overarching philosophy is that duality is not a battlefield. The tension between neon and radon is not a war to be won by suppressing one side. The goal is to hold that opposing tension long enough that the system is forced to make a quantum leap into higher coherence.
That sounds remarkably similar to Carl Jung's concept of the transcendent function, where holding the tension of opposites eventually generates a new unifying symbol. Bandel is using the periodic table instead of mythological symbols. I want to push back on the idea of Oganesson as the ultimate unified state. In chemistry, element 118 was synthesized by smashing californium with calcium ions. It is an artificial creation that barely exists before decaying. Why choose such a fleeting, synthetic element as the symbol for permanent spiritual integration?
That is perhaps the most profound paradox in the entire OKM matrix. In nature, helium, neon, and argon are ancient. They have existed since the early universe. Oganesson requires an immense amount of intentional energy to create. By making Oganesson the symbol of the unified self, Bandel suggests the true integration is not our natural default state. It is not something we passively fall into. It is a synthetic, highly complex achievement that requires massive intentional force, the collision of opposites, to bring into existence. While the physical atom decays in milliseconds, the metaphysical state it represents is a permanent reorganization of consciousness.
That interpretation gives the model much more weight. It moves it away from passive philosophies that suggest enlightenment is just a matter of relaxing into the universe. Bandel's model demands pressure. It demands the chaos leap.
It requires the individual to act as a particle accelerator for their own soul, smashing their fragmented awareness together until something entirely new is forged.
That aligns perfectly with his background. Bandel has spent years translating early 20th century German literature. Authors like Hans Heinz Ewers and Karl Hans Strobel, who explored the darker, more intense aspects of the human psyche. He's comfortable with the idea that growth requires navigating dark, chaotic, and high-pressure environments. The oak matrix is his attempt to systematize that process. The noble gas bodies are essentially containment vessels for different frequencies of human experience. You have to fill those vessels, experience the stress of their separation, and then use that very stress to force the integration.
Let us look closer at the specific mapping. Argon is labeled emotional fire, while krypton is upper emotional and xenon is lower emotional. Argon makes up about 1% of the Earth's atmosphere. It is ubiquitous but invisible, much like baseline emotional energy. Splitting the emotional spectrum into krypton and xenon suggests a strict hierarchy of feeling.
The separation into upper and lower emotional bodies is a classic esoteric trope, reflecting the division between base, instinctual reactions and refined aspirational feelings. Xenon, the heavier gas, represents the dense, lower emotional states, perhaps jealousy, territoriality, or raw survival fear. Krypton, lighter than xenon, governs the upper emotional states, compassion, aesthetic appreciation, or altruism. By categorizing them as distinct bodies, Bandel implies that you cannot eradicate the lower emotions. You cannot banish xenon from the system. You have to integrate it.
Which brings us back to radon. Radon is naturally radioactive and often accumulates in basements, the literal foundation of a house. Bandel maps it to the elemental or sexual body. It is a fitting analogy. It is heavy, it sits at the base, and it emits energy that can be dangerous if unventilated, but is undeniably powerful.
The radon analogy is brilliant. Sexual and elemental drives are the foundation of biological life, but they are volatile. In esoteric traditions, the root chakra, or the base Sephiroth, often deals with these primal energies. By calling it radon, Bandel acknowledges both its foundational necessity and its latent danger. The challenge in Anchor 4 is not to vent the radon away completely, but to bring it into archetypal resonance with the neon mental light and the helium spiritual unity.
The transition between these states must be where the chaos leap occurs. When you discuss dissipative structures, it implies that the human psyche is an open system exchanging energy with its environment. As we take in more information, more emotional stress, and more elemental drives, the system becomes turbulent. The traditional psychological approach is to reduce the input, to calm the system down. Bandel demands we keep the system open until it is forced to reorganize.
He demands that we trust the turbulence. In a dissipative structure, the turbulence is not a sign of failure. It is the system searching for a new pattern. If you artificially calm the system, you prevent the evolution. You remain trapped in the fragmented state, constantly managing the friction between your neon intellect and your xenon lower emotions. The chaos leap requires surrendering to the stress of that friction, trusting that archetypal resonance will eventually pull the fragmented bodies into the unified Oganesson structure.
It is an ambitious synthesis of chemistry, chaos theory, and hermetic philosophy. What stands out most is how heavily it relies on the concept of forced evolution through stress. Bandel's does not offer a comfortable path. The noble gas body's model requires the individual to endure the friction of their own internal contradictions until the heat of that friction sparks a quantum leap in awareness.
It is a profound reframing of psychological pain. In this model, internal conflict is not a sign of failure. It is the prerequisite for the next level of integration.
We are taught to seek peace by avoiding contradiction. Bandel is telling us that contradiction is the engine. The noble gases are inert only in their physical chemistry. In his framework, they are highly active components of a spiritual machine that only functions when put under immense pressure.
The idea of archetypal resonance acting as a bridge is fascinating. If you have two different noble gases, say neon, representing mental light, and xenon, representing lower emotional states, they exist at completely different atomic weights and frequencies. The text mentions that the first 2 points must share a frequency to begin the sync. This implies that integration is not a sudden, all-at-once event, despite the chaos leap. It starts with finding a common vibrational ground between two adjacent states.
That is a crucial detail. You cannot leap from radon directly to helium. You have to establish a resonant frequency between the lower emotional states of xenon and the upper emotional states of krypton first. It is a cascading effect. Once two adjacent bodies resonate, they create a stronger harmonic field that begins to pull the other layers into alignment. The activate rings instruction refers to consciously engaging the boundaries of these states, becoming hyper-aware of where your mental logic ends and your emotional reactions begin.
Which requires a level of self-observation that borders on clinical. You have to watch your own reactions and categorize them into these discrete elemental buckets. It is a form of active meditation. But instead of watching your thoughts pass like clouds, you are isolating them, identifying their atomic weight, and deliberately trying to vibrate them at a frequency that matches another part of your psyche.
And that is why he uses the term forge. The text states that each gas forges an astral body. Forging is an active, often violent process involving heat and hammering. The awareness is not naturally given to us in a unified state. We start fragmented. The work of Anchor 4 is to act as the blacksmith for your own consciousness. You take the raw material of your psychological drives, the radon, the xenon, the argon, and subject them to the heat of the chaos leap to forge them into a unified whole.
The end point, becoming Oganesson's womb, remains the most challenging concept to visualize. A womb implies a place of gestation and birth. If Oganesson is the unified self, then reaching that state is not the end of the journey. It is the creation of a new, highly complex container.
That captures the essence of the OK matrix. Integration is not a static endpoint. It is the creation of a new, highly complex container. The unified self is not a resting place. It is a generative space. By achieving that level of coherence, you build a womb capable of giving birth to a higher level of reality. The chaos leap is just the labor required to build the container.
It reframes the entire goal of personal development. The objective is not to become a polished, stress-free individual. The objective is to become a complex, resonant container, capable of holding all the disparate elements of the universe without fracturing. If you found this breakdown of the Oak Matrix and the noble gas bodies compelling, send this episode to a friend who appreciates the intersection of hard science and esoteric philosophy.